Okay, well, I think we're about 1 minute in. Just to respect everybody's time, I think we'll get going here. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar discussing cybersecurity and compliance issues surrounding a data breach. This is part of CWDL's webinar series on key mortgage industry topics for our clients and friends of the industry. CWDL continues to be entrenched in the mortgage banking space and focused on what's top of mind for our clients and our colleagues. We're extremely excited to have our guests and legal experts, James Brody and Sean Stevens of Johnston Thomas Attorneys at Law. Mr. Brody is the chairman of the firm's mortgage banking practice and manages all the complex litigation and mitigation on regulatory compliance. He has practiced law for close to 20 years, with 18 of those being dedicated to mortgage banking. Mr. Stevens, also a seasoned and dedicated mortgage banking attorney, has 22 years of experience, as well as his CMB, and is also the president and chief legal officer at Metroplex Mortgage Services. Both hold impressive resumes and are key to our discussion today. Dustin Pfluger, CPA and mortgage banking partner at CWDL, and Mark Wilson, founder and managing partner at CWDL, will provide an interactive dialogue to discuss the ever-present reality of cybersecurity, compliance, and how to protect from a data breach. Couple of housekeeping items. Please feel free to type in questions into the Q&A area. We're going to do our best to answer all of those, but if we don't, we'll definitely follow up. And we will also follow up with a recording of today's webinar. With that, let's get started.
Oh, I think you're on mute, the ever-changing world of Zoom calls. The phrase here is you're on mute.
Sorry, I should have known, but yes, thank you, Casey. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, James and Sean, for joining us for this webinar. So with that, I guess, yeah, we can just go ahead and kick it off. And I guess just opening, why don't, James, Sean, why don't you just kind of set the scene for us, what we're going to talk about, why we're talking about it, why it's kind of a hot topic right now. And then we can go from there.
Well, I mean, look, I think, and I appreciate and thank you all for having us here and everyone for joining. This is a topic that's been of great interest to a lot of people. As you've seen over the last year or two, there's been a lot of reports in the news, about all of these various ransomware attacks, these Zoom bombings, things that are happening as our industry and the world become much more technologically advanced. In those ways, it opens up and makes right your company, your personal information, and in our particular industry, where lenders, brokers, and everyone are handling all of this sensitive personal information, you have to be extra careful because you're going to go ahead and expose yourself. I mean, just as an attorney, as any regular business, I get these emails on a nearly daily basis, phishing scams, where I'll take a look. It says, hey, James, can you come down to my office, or can you go help me out with something? And it looks completely legitimate. And so the problem is that once you go ahead and expose yourself in your companies, or you get attacked and you do the right thing, it can cost you a heck of a lot of money. I mean, on the one hand, you're having to look at which state it happened in, or which state was affected, who do you have to notify, which state attorney generals do you need to notify, which consumers do you need to notify. But it's a bigger issue than just even the ransomware attacks. I mean, what we've been seeing, and maybe we'll talk about a little more later, is things like LOs. LOs get up, they leave their business every single day. They're always looking for the greener grass, and a lot of times they'll end up taking some of this information with them. They'll use it. They'll try to get those consumers over to do the loans there. That in and of itself is a data breach. So there's a lot of regulations. It's still in the process of being regulated, and I mean, even they just came out with the new safeguards rule as part of the GLBA that's really affecting IMBs and brokers, with more strict requirements as far as what to do. But that's kind of it in a nutshell. I mean, Sean, what other items might you mention insofar as the landscape?
From just to tie on what you said on the mortgage banking, mortgage broker, mortgage lending, whatever step in the ladder you're at, that's really the primary, the foremost guard for that consumer protection of that personal information. And the consumers are they're trusting the mortgage lending industry, bankers, brokers, lenders alike, to really be that safeguard. And as James mentioned, they're expanding on the safeguards rule, where they're putting really specific core requirements in there that these lending institutions have to meet, instead of the general umbrella, more or less, which they had before. And as we go through today, and then it kind of jumps ahead a little bit, but with the myriad of state laws and how the consumers are spread out, obviously, as everybody knows, the mortgage lending is more or less a nationwide type of industry, some lenders being regional, some being maybe in only one state, but many having that national presence. So as you start crossing state boundaries and the personal information, the data breach laws change from state to state, it becomes even more complex, and you really have to have an arsenal, a team behind you who can navigate that process in case, unfortunately, and hopefully this never happens, but if that data breach does occur.
So that's a good point. I mean, to kind of jump off here, Sean, and we can talk through. So we're talking through state laws, we're talking through, federal laws. Why don't y'all just take us through a little bit, just on, what laws are surrounding it, maybe starting at the federal level, and then you can touch on the state level. I mean, we're not getting into all 50 states, obviously, but just kind of touch on, federally what they're responsible for, then state what they're responsible for. We can kind of start there.
Great question. So wouldn't it be nice if there was just one blanket federal law which governed all of the data breach notification, the data breach type of situations? But of course, it's not like that. Now it's made up of a patchwork. Each of the 50 states has their own separate, unique data breach law, which we'll get into today, some of the nuances. But with that comes different definitions for personal information, different breach notification laws, different notification requirements. So, and then when you have consumers in each state, depending on where they get affected, that's where the data breach law is going to apply. So federally, you have as James mentioned, you have the GLBA, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which they haven't updated under the safeguard rule since back in 2002. But now they just issued a proposed rule on October 27th, where they really expanded that and dug into certain things where you're going to have requirements for multi-factor authentication for certain users, written information policies, identify individuals who are going to be responsible for the security of the personal information. So as of right now, we're still in this patchwork framework where, especially as I just mentioned, for those lenders who are nationwide, regional, whatnot, it's really, you've got to be in tune with what requirements are in those different state locales.
So who does have jurisdiction in the states? I mean, is it where the consumer is? Is it where the corporate headquarters is where the breach occurs? If it's a branch location, I get so who has the ultimate state jurisdiction, I guess?
You're going to be looking, so the data breach notification laws will apply where the consumer gets affected.
Got it.
Yeah, that's where the notification requirements, really are. And, as I think Sean mentioned, there is nothing federally, of course, as far as notification. But there are, a number of different requirements. Some states very minimal, some states very strict. And I think maybe it was Massachusetts actually just made biometric data, personal information that can't be shared, which, at the end of the day, they're, as far as I know, they're the only state that has that. And so your fingerprints are now included in that. And, part of the problem with these various definitions, because we had one particular client who reached out to us, and we found out their entire policy was based on the wrong definition of what personal information was. So that, made a whole systemic change. And, at the end of the day, depending on what states, our clients may be licensed in, their compliance folks, their in-house counsel need to have a very strict set of guidelines for them and their companies so they don't run afoul of that.
So just out of curiosity, I mean, this may be too general, it may, may wasn't quite on our script here, but, just in general, because we have people all over the country listening, we have clients all over the country. I mean, what are some of the more strict states versus some of the more lenient states, just in your experience, if you can name that? If not, I totally understand.
Well, I think that I actually have a short list here of some of the different states that came out. But let's say Delaware. Here's just a few kind of nuances to take into consideration. That Delaware and Utah say that affiliated business sharing is very strict. So when you're sharing information with an affiliated business, but Delaware doesn't apply to all consumers. You have Colorado, which has the shortest time frames with very strict extension requirements or rules. Massachusetts, some of the states have minimum numbers. If you say have a breach with 200 consumers, then you need to go ahead and notify the state attorney general in writing of that breach. Well, Massachusetts doesn't have any minimum numbers. So if one consumer is affected, you need to go ahead and notify Massachusetts Attorney General. So that is, number one, notifying the consumers, and number two, notifying the state attorney general in writing to see, what they want to go ahead and do about that. I think that Wisconsin, is my understanding, is the least restrictive because it only applies to HIPAA in the government. And then the state that made the first biometric data was Illinois.
Got it. Okay. So it just kind of depends on what we're talking about, strict and what, and that kind of thing. It sounds like, Massachusetts sounds fun. So, okay, well, that sounds good. So, I mean, I guess let's get into just kind of, what, like if you could just kind of talk through, Sean, James, both, whatever, just kind of what the elements of a data breach are, kind of what it kind of means and what it looks like, and yeah, just in your opinion or your thoughts or whatever. So,
as you mentioned, as the definitions are going to vary from state to state, some of the general elements would be unauthorized or unlawful acquisition of what's commonly referred to as PI, personal information. And then that information is then compromise the security, confidentiality, or integrity of such. So, but as what really gets, I guess, on the complexities is the definitions, the little nuances between each one. And I know we have a really good comparison between which, and that kind of goes back to circle back to where your question was, what's a little more strict versus a little more lenient. Yep. There's California has a wide ranging definition, which is very broad and pulls in a whole slew of information. Whereas versus Texas, on the other hand, is more limited. And what many also associate personal information is, we had a lender client which was really hanging on the fact that if they didn't lose any social security numbers, then they didn't lose any of the personal information. And here I get perfect. So you got here's like the California definition. And this is in California, they have two separate, under the civil code, there's two different definitions. There's one that relates to an agency, and there's one here relates to a business. And the 1790, and this one right here is the correct one for that purposes. So if you can see here on the screen, the bolded numbers from the mortgage banking standpoint, all these are important because they all encompass a personal information. But those specific bolded numbers or bolded words are those common elements that get built into the application process: pre-qualification, application, denied loans, pre-approved loans, whatnot. All those would encompass many of this data and information, which really makes it a scary premise for the mortgage bankers out there. And even under that FTC safeguard rule, they're expanding that to include mortgage brokers as well. Also, I saw in there, it's going to be real estate appraisers too, they're including with that. So it gets really scary, and it's going to be a ripple effect through vendors, not just the mortgage industry itself, obviously. And then
Sorry, and I should have started at the beginning, Sean, that to tell everybody we do have some slides that I will be pulling up time to time, and that's what's pulled up right now when we get into some of these detailed definitions and examples and stuff like that. We thought it'd be good, Sean and James, to have some examples. So sorry, Sean, go ahead. I just
No, you're perfect. That's great.
I was going to ask something real quick back on the other. So if maybe you can give me some examples. That obviously this is information that all our clients are gathering, and maybe you can walk through a little bit of it, like how some of your how some clients protect themselves against this, these breaches, and kind of real life examples, and then also, there's all the risks that are associated. You have reputation risk. Obviously, this information gets out that data has been breached in a particular company, and there's other risks associated with that. Maybe you can walk through that a little bit too.
James, you want me to take that, or?
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and say, I mean, look, at the end of the day, and I'm not sure who put it out, maybe Sean, you know the name, but there's a 4-pillar approach to data protection. I mean, at the end of the day, what we do whenever we're consulting in the sense of a proactive, a mitigation posture, as opposed to when it happens, because a lot of times when we come in, the breach has occurred, and now we're having to go through, get the forensic examiners into the systems, deal with the notifications and all of that. But there is a 4-pillar data protection that requires 2-factor authentication and a number of different things, Sean can expand upon. But, the reality is that dealing with this upfront, having a strong set of policies and procedures, having cyber insurance, which is skyrocketing now in its premiums because it is, because of so many attacks. Those are some of the things that can be done, as well as having an incident response team or response team to deal with it from each and every department who's clued in on what needs to be done if and when there is some form of attack. But, Sean, maybe you can walk through some of the more, the bullets on that.
For example, as we mentioned before, the multi-factor authentication. There's also tokens that they have out there to assist with that MFA. The phishing training, which is really a critical aspect. That's where your organization can generate, this is becoming more and more common, not just for the mortgage industry, but just any industry who's trying to protect themselves. As Jaden mentioned, law firms are a big target of that as well too.
We've done that ourselves, the phishing protection.
And that what that does is it sends out, and you may have to get with your IT provider or your email hosted. If a lot of people have hosted email solutions, you may have to get with them to override any current permissions or security that's in there in order to initiate and whitelist these type of the phishing examples. And what that's going to do is just send to your employees. They'll send to you as well too. And you'll just go out there, and they've got different levels of basically strength as far as you have the highest level. And then let's say 1 through 5, for example, is one I've seen before. And the highest level will give the trickiest type of version, for lack of better words. Office 365 might be a series. And when they click on that wire transfer, especially in our industry, because they're trying to really prey upon, especially those end of month type of users where everything's flying around, everyone's got to get their closing. They see the wire come in from the title company. They got to click that link so they can keep moving on with the closing. So what this will do is then this will send back a report to the admin. And at that point, you'll be able to go in and physically follow that up with training, because no matter what we talk about, like the Microsoft, the 4-pillar approach, as James mentioned, that is so critical to lay in that foundation. Everything comes back to human error. You could have the most sophisticated guards up, the gates, everything that's protecting. But if that human error happens, it is all that work has been for naught. So I can't express it enough. The follow up, the training, let's say you tie in with these phishing type of training, and then you follow up with the in-person meetings with the people that may have clicked on the link. Maybe they opened it, maybe they didn't click on it, but that type of training to really emphasize how critical it is to not make that mistake, not take that step, take a deep breath, make sure you look at the email and really hover over the domain, look for spelling errors, all those type of nuances that I'm sure many of us are aware of.
And just to kind of add, so I was just going to say, to add to that, part of the problem has been exacerbated by COVID when you have a remote workforce, when you have people doing air printing sensitive documents, when they're sharing Wi-Fi's at home with others, maybe they're not secured, it's extremely important to get your policies and procedures tightened up, especially for those who are now working remotely, which, you know, is still a fairly significant size of the workforce in our industry and without.
So that's a good point. I was going to ask another question, but I'll go on that for just a second here, James. So what I mean, we went over some examples there, you know, Sean did of what clients are doing. What have you seen changed, or what do you see clients doing now that has changed? Again, a real world example to kind of be proactive with this. I mean, are they actually going to people's homes and checking their internet, or is it like, I mean, yeah, so just elaborate on that a little bit if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, they're not necessarily, I'm not aware of anyone that's going to anyone's home. Nevertheless, you know, they are going ahead, they are beefing up their policies and procedures on these issues. You know, one of the things, and maybe we'll talk about it later with regard to, say, the cyber insurance, is just going through that process, finding out all the questions that they ask. Even if you don't end up getting the policy, going through that process is an education in and of itself. You know, they have special vendors and companies who are coming in, who are dealing with a lot of the IT and the security part of it. But I think the biggest change is people's attention is now on the subject in a way that just wasn't the case, you know, a few years ago. And that is probably, to me, the most important, because you can't start fixing the problem until you actually appreciate what that problem is.
Got it. Okay. Okay. One thing I did want to back up real quick, because I think, you know, you mentioned something, James, at the beginning of the call that you know, I thought of. I think a lot of people, when they think of data breaches, they think of, you know, external third parties, you know, coming in maliciously or whatever. So it sounds like this could be, like you mentioned, just an LO walking away with data, and maybe not even meaning to. They may walk away with lists in their emails or stuff like that, and that could technically constitute a data breach then, right?
Well, look, that's absolutely right. I mean, you know, for several years, because of the nature of our industry being, you know, fairly fluid, you know, we both defend, say, lenders, as well as represent lenders who lose their branch, lose their employees, or who bring them on. And a lot of times they want to go to their new company. They want to go ahead and start off, you know, running instead of going about it the right way. And, you know, when it comes to that, say, pipeline theft. So, you know, we have several cases right now where, let's say, an LO or a branch, you know, ended up taking their pipeline and they carried it to the next business. They say, hey, this is our book of business. We can do whatever we want. Well, that's not necessarily the case. And so, you know, regardless of whether the original lender is a victim of that, they still have an obligation because that data was theirs. They have to go ahead and notify those consumers. And then they have to notify the state attorney generals, and they have to understand and appreciate how, you know, deep the problem is. So ultimately, we have to go after those former employees, you know, for a variety of reasons. But part of the damages that we seek are those damages for having to deal with those notification and compliance requirements. And God forbid you don't do the notification. I mean, you know, there was a case out in New York. They had this company had a data breach. They failed to report it, and they ended up having to settle for $1.5 million just a couple of years later because they didn't do what they were supposed to have done. So, you know, that's really.
How would a lender even know if that, I mean, if that occurred? I mean, or what obligation do they have to, I guess that's a better way to phrase it. What obligation does a lender have to put safeguards in place, or to research that, I guess is the only word I can think of, after an LO leaves or a branch manager? I mean, if they just walk away, you never hear from them again, you know, you don't think they're pinging current clients. I mean, do they have some kind of obligation to go find out, I guess is the question.
Well, I think first off, you do have an obligation to erect those safeguards, you know, always. Otherwise, you know, because there's not a lot of private rights of action around the country in the states that say if you have a data breach, you know, a consumer can come after you. But they still have common law causes of action like negligence and you know, other various issues where you establish that they had a duty to protect you, and they do by statute. So but getting to your question of what your affirmative obligation is to say, you know, go ahead and research when you have an LO who leaves. I mean, the bottom line is, you know, there's going to be a lot of times you may just not know. But, you know, when you are, let's say, for the instance where the LO or a branch leaves, you know, part of the standard operating procedure is to go ahead and say, hey, what loans were in their pipeline? What's going on with them? We need to take care of them. So, you know, but there's going to be those times that you just don't know, and you can't really have an affirmative obligation to be aware of something that you just don't know. But, you know, if let's say there's a ransomware attack, well, you're going to find out pretty soon because your systems are going to go down, and they're going to send you a request that they want you to send, you know, 10,000 Ethereum tokens to some special wallet in the Netherlands. So, you know, you're going to find out fast. But I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, unless Sean has something else that he wants to add, I mean, I think that's a good, you led right into where I was going to transition, is into ransomwares. You know, we spent about almost half the call now talking about data breaches. So I guess let's just focus in on, you know, ransomwares. I think those are the ones that probably make the bigger headline news, because you hear people being, you know, held hostage for $10 million, or you know, they sent it out, they wired it out on accident, whatever it is. So yeah, I mean, why don't y'all touch a little bit just on, you know, the compliance concerns and what, you know, what lenders should be aware of when it comes to, you know, ransomware specifically.
And Dustin, could I back up? Because you said something that triggered about the remote workforce.
Yep.
Especially if you, like you made the comment, do you go to their house to inspect it? You know, that's really touchy, obviously. But for those, like, one of the big issues, a lot of viewers on the, I mean, they're going to really hit home is the RDP, the remote desktop protocol, where there's security issues involved with that for the remote workforce. You can set up remote, we have clients that have remote printing policies, so they can't print documents, getting documents onto USB drives, not allowing them to do that from their server settings. And then, as James is mentioning, is you're trying to find out when that loan officer left, what emails did they send out to themselves? Did they try to export data? Those type of things. So that remote workforce, if they are printing documents, do you have a proper, maybe a shredded type of document destruction service set up? So those are the type of things to help be a little bit proactive. I mean, obviously outside as we transition to ransomware, which is more the actual human mistake or the human issues of taking things out the remote workforce. Yeah. But those are some things that we're seeing, monitoring capabilities, being able to monitor those remote workforce, your handheld devices. You can have the Outlook, your O365, you can have remote wiping capabilities on there. So there is a number of things companies can do to be proactive.
Okay, no, that's perfect. Thanks for clarifying that. Sorry, I didn't mean to just jump straight in. I asked for your thoughts and then jump straight into the next one. So sorry. So
no.
Yeah.
And so with regard to the ransomware, you know, side of it, you know, some things to consider. I mean, again, you have all of these safety precautions, you get your policies and procedures tightened up, you do your best there, you have your consultants, and you still get hit. Okay, they're going to want to go ahead and for instance, when we just talked about, you know, they make a demand in Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever, you know, monetary, you know, amount they want. Well, you have a duty to check to make sure that these people aren't on, you know, a list of people who, you know, because where is it here? If you go ahead and end up paying the wrong people, and is it, where's the rule, Sean?
You got to check the Office of Foreign Asset Control.
Yeah, right. So you got to check. They have a list, and if you don't do that, it's strict liability if you end up paying the money, because everyone wants to know. Okay, look, it's great that you don't want us to pay. It's great that you want to set a policy that so that people stop doing this. But when your company gets taken down and you're losing money left and right, well, you're going to look at ways to get out of that. And sometimes that requires actually, you know, paying these people because you want to get this thing moving. And the first thing that you need to do when that happens is, you know, number one, check to see if you have coverage, because, you know, once you get hit, the fees and the costs and everything else that come with it are extremely, you know, burdensome. You need to have forensic people come in, look at your database, see where the breach was, see the extent of it, see whose information was compromised. And that right there is a big expense in and of itself. You have reputational issues. You need legal counsel. So there's a variety of things that need to happen the moment you get hit with that ransomware attack that should all be ready to go. It should already be planned for. The heads of each department, the board should have a plan, a disaster plan in place, so that whenever that type of incident happens, they're able to respond in a quick, timely, and competent manner.
Yeah, you know what's funny is that as you bring this up, it's not funny actually. None of this is funny if it happens, but we had an FBI person come talk to our firm one day about this, and we're going through, you know, what we should do if there is a data breach and if we get a ransomware, what are you supposed to do? And this is one of the head guys at the FBI heading up this whole task force. And they said originally when this was happening, they found the fastest way to get out of the mess was actually pay the ransom. And that was what the FBI had put on an official document on FBI letterhead as how do you respond? And of course, the agent who did that actually got in trouble and said, we're not telling people to pay these ransoms. That's not what we're going to do. And I think they've kind of changed that approach. So I'm wondering, have you seen, like, it's interesting. I think once you get a breach, even if you do everything correct and you just have, like you said, the one person that clicks and opens the phishing email and you know, what, like, step one, what do you do? Like, what do you, besides call you guys, right? Call you right away. But
that's always a good first step.
That's a good first step. Call you guys right away. But really, what is this other than, you know, running to your servers and turning everything off, or, you know, if you're a cloud-based, getting the cloud system, you know, all those different things. But what do you recommend the very first thing that you do?
Yeah, I mean, you know, first off, you want to stop the bleeding and make sure that there's no other, you know, attacks or no other information being extracted. So, you know, shutting everything down. But you should have, again, a plan that lays out the steps of the protocol. You really do need to make sure that you have, you know, and hopefully your company, although there's plenty of companies out there that don't really have a strong IT, they have outside consultants that come in. And, you know, you really need that level of expertise to look at these problems. But, you know, outside of any
to see where the weaknesses in the plan may be. So you have your IT department, legal counsel, insurance, the carrier, just so they have those plans in place with that incident response team. And so that plan is also appropriate for the size of the organization too.
Yeah, and I would go ahead and pull your team members together so everyone is on the same page. But also, when you do that, and you know, putting the attorney hat on here, you always have to worry about attorney-client privilege. So you want to make certain that, you know, you're not going ahead and admitting to something that, you know, I mean, because the bottom line is ultimately you could be facing lawsuits from consumers. You could be facing regulatory action. So you want to have a tight message control as well as the reputational issues. And reputation is everything. You know, if this gets out, you know, which it more likely than not will, especially in this day and age where there's such a spotlight on this issue, you want to make sure that you have a messaging system and you want to have a point of contact in your incident response plan of who's going to be responsible for what. And if you're not the one that's responsible for that, you need to keep you need to keep things quiet unless and until you have, you know, the ability, the permission, the authority to do that. Because one thing said in the wrong context can and will, you know, be held against you depending on who it is. So, you know, one of the things that we can do, and I think we had talked about it while we were planning this session, is to provide some more PowerPoint materials that you can disseminate to the attendees and your clients that have, you know, somewhat of an incident response checklist or some things to think about that might be helpful to them, you know, to kind of see. And again, I'm a big believer that even if you don't get cyber insurance, going through the process to see if you qualify for it, is a process that is educational and can be a big value in and of itself.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a good, so we'll get into the cyber thing here in a second, or the cyber insurance policy here in a second. We'll come back to that. I do want to back
Sure.
up one step before even the first step. Just what are some things in your experience that you've seen, that are just common practices in our industry that maybe lenders don't even know they're doing that can lead to a data breach? I mean, what are some of just the examples that you see out there on that?
So in addition to whatever, Sean has, the bottom line is that it's a lot of human error outside of these bad actors. When I say bad actors, I mean the people that are making these attacks. Bad actors, I would characterize as, say, LOs who are leaving, who may be taking that information and disseminating it without authorization. So outside of the bad actors, faulty computer systems, lacks, negligence, really just, as I think Sean mentioned at the beginning, our industry in a lot of ways is about speed. And, you want to get those deals done. And, as you have that press for speed, your customers, your company, it tends to, in that type of environment, you tend to make mistakes. And for instance, clicking on that email that you shouldn't be clicking on, because it does, on first glance, look exactly like you would expect. But when you actually look at the name behind John Smith, it's some string of numbers and some name that kind of would shock you. But it doesn't always show up that way on your email to and from. So I think that's a big part of the problem is just human error outside of bad actors and malfeasance.
It's funny you say that, because I'm always just shocked with how terrible those email addresses actually are when you look at them. Like, I would think that they would come up with better, email address. I mean, the name's right, but then when you actually look at the email address, you're right away like, what is this? Like, this doesn't even make sense. So it's just funny you say that. I get, it's just yeah, it's funny. So.
No, it's absolutely right, and it just takes one. I mean, it's. And I think, we saw the safeguards rule, hadn't been, nothing had been done to it since 2002. It was just done, I think, about a week ago. So that will be in the news, but there's going to be a lot more, regulation on this. And I really do think, while I'm not a huge believer in over-regulation, I think this is an area where we could stand to have some federal guidance to the extent that's possible, to try and bring some of these standards, into sort of a common, framework, so that, if you're in 30, 40 different states, you already have enough problems knowing what all the differences are there. This is something that would be ripe for that, and I think would be beneficial for our industry and our country as a whole.
Got it. Okay. So I guess maybe not changing gears a little bit, but what is the obligation of a mortgage bank if they have a data breach for reporting? Like, what should they consider, for reporting? And then what happens if they? I mean, I think maybe more importantly, what happens if they don't respond to a data breach or don't report? I mean, it's kind of a two-part question there. I mean, I think we've covered kind of what when they need to report that, and it's very different. We've gone over that, but I mean, what happens if they don't respond? I guess let's go that way. Like, if they just choose to ignore it, or yeah.
Well, I mentioned there was that one case, and it'll be in that materials out of New York, where they did have a data breach. It was back in 2019, and through their safety and soundness review, it was found out that they had this back in 2020, and because they didn't report it, they ultimately got hit with a $1.5 million, fine that they agreed to, and a consent order, and that's all made public. And reputationally, I mean, even if depending on the company size, sometimes $1.5 million might not be huge dollars, but for the vast majority of businesses out there, I think that's a significant chunk of change. So you can also face those borrower actions. Sometimes there are state statutes that allow a private right of action. to proceed. But even where there's not, you have all those common laws, such as just simple negligence. So those are the things that you need to be concerned about. And I think they're going to be paying closer and closer attention as this is, in the public spotlight. Sean, what else would you have to say insofar as the duties and repercussions?
Well, one of the things as far as the notification requirements, knowing the statute as well, as you mentioned, James, how many affected individuals for each state. We compare California, it's more than, I believe it's more than 500. In Texas involves at least 250, if I recall. So knowing each state, as you cross each state line, you're going to have different notification requirements. And as James mentioned, we talked about that not only involves the consumers itself, but the attorney general and maybe the credit reporting agencies as well too, could be a possibility. So just depending on what state you're conducting business in, I would strongly recommend dig into the weeds, understand the regulations affecting you, or it could be multiple states, and then you might need to get other help involved with that too.
Is there some sort of cheat sheet out there that has what by state who needs to get notified and the rule? Is there some sort of tool that you guys know about where we can find that information?
I'm not aware of one I'm sure there must be, but I'm not aware of one that specifically just says, list all the states as well as their time requirements. But that's something at the end of the day, it probably wouldn't be very difficult for us to actually put that together in the sense of, having that cheat sheet. But, you should have a sheet that has all that information for your company in every state that you're licensed in. One thing that you were talking about affirmative duties that we haven't mentioned yet is really the problem with your vendors. You're responsible for your vendors. Which of your vendors is handling sensitive personal information? Have you done your homework on that vendor to make sure that they have coverage, that they have policies and procedures? So that's another thing, right up front that your companies need to do in order to make sure they properly protect themselves.
So when you say vendors, I'm assuming that means pretty much every vendor that they give data to. Any vendor. Do they do y'all recommend, and this maybe getting in more into vendor management or something like that,
Sure.
that maybe kind of the scope a little bit, but do you guys recommend risk weighting the vendors? Some you may give little bits of information, some may get entire loan files, whatever. Is that kind of when they're looking at this kind of stuff? I would assume it's probably hard to do full due diligence on every one of the vendors that touch a mortgage company. There's so many vendors out there touching stuff. So, how do you guys, I guess, kind of recommend approaching that? Is it obviously riskiest ones first, or do you say just everybody? What's your thoughts there?
Well, we've done, and you're right, it does get into the vendor management part, but as with most things, there's not strict separations, they tend to overlap. So when it gets to the vendor management, I'm a believer in, of course, making sure that you have kind of a scorecard, and there's a lot of details that go into that with regard to, what priority, what purpose does that company serve? What is the liability that you have? Are they receiving sensitive information, or are they just cleaning your office? At the end of the day, you need to go ahead and have a risk-based, review, because not everyone is going to be the same as the other, and not all liabilities and exposures are going to be equal. So, making sure that you hone in on especially those vendors who have access to that information, and those who may be responsible for handling it in any way, I would say is probably at the top of the list. That I would want to make sure that they get, a front forward audit, of what their policies and procedures are, what their coverage is, make sure that it gets incorporated into your vendor contracts, so that you have that, extra, a hook there. If you get hit because of them, you sure as heck are going to go after them and make them pay to the extent they're able. And you want to make sure that it's a company that's going to have money, if you get hit, so that you can collect on that.
Okay. That makes sense. Anything, Sean, you want to add to that piece, or is that?
He's Rob, a good point. Even with the, let's say you might not consider it as a risk, but the cleaning staff, What are your policies that you have in place to safeguard any just the personal information laying on somebody's desk, for example? Just the things you're not thinking of. What are I'm going back to the point we said, having those policy and procedures where everybody knows, okay, after you're done working, you got to put this away. Is it a locked cabinet it's in? Is it something that someone doesn't need access to? Can they get to that information? Has that vendor been vetted? Whether it's the cleaning crew or the next level up, maybe it's the document destruction company that's coming in. What are their credentials? What have they been vetted for? Maybe it's whoever's handling your next level of personal information transition. Maybe it's a CRM, for example. Another thing you can do as well too is have the IP address restrictions, which limits who can get to what programs on top of the multi-factor authentication. So really, as mentioned, being on the forefront, trying to be proactive to eliminate and vet those vendors too are equally important.
It's a great point. Simple things that you don't think about, right? The underwriter's underwriting a file, it's late, they get up and leave. I think that's a big, it's a risk that most of our clients probably don't think about, right? I mean, that's one risk they're probably not super in tune with. So I guess from an action perspective, you make sure that that the cleaning company has the proper insurance, and that there's some safeguards there, and then also put your stuff away, lock it away before you leave, and that sort of thing. Interesting. Make sure your computer isn't up, password protected. So your computer automatically goes to sleep mode, that you have to log into it. So it's not just open in an open source area where people can access. So
yeah, again, it comes down to that human error and setting yourself up, for this type of attack, for this type of breach.
Yeah.
Your password on your sticky note and put it on your computer screen.
Exactly. Yeah. Password, which I've been guilty of that in the past. I think I know we have some more questions. I want to encourage anybody who is listening to make sure that you send your questions in. If you do have any, I'll make sure, because we're getting close. We have about 10 minutes left. And we still have more to talk about, but if you do have questions, make sure you put them in the chat so we can respond.
Yeah, we can move to probably our last topic here, and we've kind of touched on it all throughout and kind of alluded to it, and I said to come back to it. So just talking on the subject of insurance, cyber insurance, insurance, what questions should vendors be asking? What should they be thinking about when they're going out to get these policies? I do have a couple slides I will pull up here in a second, because I think this is one, Sean, where you wanted to have some examples and stuff for sure. But just what should they be thinking about, I guess, when they're going through the different insurance, that they can get and will get?
Well, I'll let Sean get into the sort of more technical part on the deck pages and kind of some of those differences. But look, at the end of the day, if you get hit with one of these attacks and you don't have one of these policies, you may not actually get coverage moving forward. So it's, you have to understand that given the amount of money, the fees and costs that are going to be incurred in having to respond to something like, a pipeline theft is one thing that's not that bad. But when you get a ransomware attack, when you get some of these other attacks where you just don't even know the scope of what they may have or may not have, and you're having to pay all of these forensic examiners to go through your system to see where that was, to see who caused the breach, how it was caused. You're going to want to make sure that you don't only have, your standard protection that may give you, I don't know, $100,000 worth of coverage, because, and I don't know what the typical, final amount is, but I can tell you that with those companies, especially some of the bigger ones, they can spend, many hundreds of thousands of dollars between lawyers, consultants, reputational PR people, and it's just massive. So you want to make sure that this is an area now that everyone has to be accounting for that level of risk. And, when you're looking at what type of coverage you want, Obviously costs are going to be an important factor, but, comparing those against the costs of not having that coverage, I think is really the big question there.
Okay. Well, perfect. Well, Sean, do you want to kind of just walk through, I guess, kind of maybe the different types and just what they cover briefly? I think we have about, probably about 5 minutes before we probably need to wrap up. So if you just want to,
I'll burn through this quick.
Yeah.
So then everyone can see on there the E&O, the mortgage E&O, and the professional services liability. Just to give a broad overview on that, many people think E&O covers everything, and we run into this quite a bit. While it can extend to other things on the screen, and you're limited, it's not going to cover everything under the sun if something goes wrong. And I remember years back, they used to throw in cyber almost as if you want cyber, we'll sell it to you. It was really obtainable and really inexpensive. Now getting cyber that cost is pretty significant, even when you compare to your E&O and your fidelity bonds. So then that's your E&O coverage, your insurance, taxes, professional services liability, negligent acts that arise. Those acts that arise from the negligence of going with the process, the mortgage process, et cetera. It does not generally cover those repurchase requests, which is not today. And it's definitely not equivalent to what you're going to get under that cyber coverage. And you can see in contrast, in the cyber world, that's what's going to be really, if you could maybe, I think it might be on the next PDF possibly. It gives a breakdown of the different items that go into the cyber.
Yep.
So those are just some of the James mentioned earlier, as far as the network people that you're going to need to come in after the fact, that's going to be one of your biggest costs in this whole escapade with the data breach. Having all the engineers come in after the forensics that get involved with this, that's going to absorb your coverage very rapidly. So knowing your cost, how many records do you have? What are the costs per record? And as James mentioned, when we send you out this, we'll have the additional slide deck to provide. And we have some breakdowns in there from some reports. We have the Verizon report in there, the IBM as well too. And it gives you good general parameters on how to calculate your potential exposure. And then I guess one of the biggest things I would say, just when you're doing your renewal, when you're going into the initial application, ask questions. Know your definitions of your policy, because those are going to be that's the foundation of what's going to govern certain parameters. Security incident versus security breach, for example, could be terms on there. Know those definitions cold. Ask your carrier, ask your insurance broker questions. Have a conversation, block out a 30-minute time. Sit there and walk through your policy with them. Ask them what happens if this would occur? What happens if that would occur? Know who to call, know what your coverage actually extends to. And then also be aware of something called sublimits, where a sublimit is not in addition to your coverage, it's a sublimit of that. So you can see on this a perfect example. This is from an actual declaration page where it's got a total policy limit of $1 million, but then it also has $100,000 sublimit for social engineering. So that's segmented just for that amount. So that's not in addition to the $1 million. So you want to know your total policy coverages as well as what sublimits may apply, if any.
Right. And in this one, understand, what is social engineering? What is that?
And that's when they get into, from what I've heard, the different explanations is, and I've actually talked to carriers on this, when they impersonate, and I may not be correctly technical on this, when they impersonate someone, like for example, from what I recall, the conversation went, is they impersonate being somebody else trying to get wire information or trying to get information and going through via, let's say, you're getting that email in. So not maybe phishing, maybe it's coming from that actual person's email as well too.
Got it.
And I think to James's point earlier, he said it a couple of times. If I understood him right, that even if you decide not to get cyber, just going the exercise of going through these insurance, policies and questions, you learn a lot, and right. I mean, that's the point you made earlier, James.
Yeah, I mean, look, you always want to be careful anytime you're going, whether it's going ahead and applying for cyber or life insurance, everything that they ask you, to kind of use that other term, can and will be held against you. So, but if you are intent on this, I mean, you want to have those questions. You want to know what they're looking for because they're looking to mitigate their risk. So by asking you those questions, you have a roadmap to help you make sure you take those steps, even if you don't get it. And before because I know we're getting to the end here, one other thing to mention is, when you are looking at the response that you have to do when you're talking about lenders, they're going to have to look at their MLPAs and seller's guides because a lot of them require that they provide notification. Now, in certain circumstances, I may not advise a client to do that, depending on what it is, but you need to at least know and have the option to make that decision. So that's another thing that they need to go ahead and do is examine all their agreements, see who they have to give notification to. Are they a sponsor? Then they have to give notification to their sponsor. So there's a lot of other issues that, go into that that they really need to think of.
Well, perfect, guys. Well, I think we are right now. Casey's back on, so that's our signal that we're wrapping up here, and that she's gonna, lead us out here. But thank you. I want to say thank you both, for joining us, and we really appreciate it. And yeah, with that, Casey, you can,
wrap it up.
Real quick, I want to thank you guys for being on here also, and just I know you guys are going to provide some tools, and for those of you who don't know you guys, they do more than just this kind of work. They are attorneys in the mortgage industry. So from LO compensation, PPP challenges you might be going through, other things, I want to make sure you guys know that they are a resource, and we appreciate the resource for our firm and our clients. And I'll turn it over to Casey with that. So go ahead.
And thank you.
Yeah.
You're so welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks everybody for taking time out of your busy schedules. I know this is not something we ever want to face, but certainly something we need to think about and be prepared for. So really valuable stuff, you guys. Again, a video will go out via email, a recording of the actual webinar today. If anybody has any follow-up questions, even after this, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We'd be happy to continue the dialogue. So thanks so much. Have a great duration.
Thank you, everybody.
You guys.
Thanks, guys.
Have a great day.
Thank you.